Some of the questions in this homework talk about incomplete dominance. So here is a question to kind of refresh your memory of what incomplete dominance is. So we'll do this question together so you're able to do the one in your homework on your own. So this question says the inheritance pattern in snapdragons is incomplete dominance. What is our genotype and phenotype if we cross a homozygous red snapdragon and a homozygous white snapdragon? So you might remember a question similar to this, or a scenario similar to this, as we first talked about Mendel and as we talked about genetics. So go ahead right now without any help, try to figure out the answer to this question. Pause the video and take a few seconds, and then we'll go ahead and do parts of it together. So the best way to start the answer to a question like this is to ask yourself, what alleles can each parent contribute? So we know from the question that we have a homozygous red snapdragon and homozygous white snapdragon. So think about what alleles those could contribute. So you should have come up with this. The red snapdragon can contribute 2 big R's and the white can contribute 2 little r's. So now go ahead and, in your own way, figure out what the offspring would look like. So if you need to do a Punnett square, take a second, pause the video and do that, or if you can do it in your head, then do it that way. So you should have come up with that all the offspring would be big R, little r. So in the case of normal dominance, this would mean that all the offspring are heterozygous and that they're all red. But like we talked about, this is a case of incomplete dominance. And so the phenotype is going to lie somewhere between our two original parental phenotypes. So in this case, we actually get pink snapdragons. And so that's a very easy example of incomplete dominance, one that, like I said, you've probably seen before, and it should be helpful in figuring out the first few questions of your homework. Here's another genetics question similar to the homework. It says here, osteopetrosis, also known as marble bone disease, is an extremely rare autosomal dominant disorder where the bones harden and become denser. So if your father has this disease and your mother does not, what is the probability that you have the disease? You have 2 siblings also without the disease. Go ahead and take a second and try to figure this out by yourself, and then we'll talk it through. Alright, let's go ahead and talk through this one. So a couple mistakes that some people make typically involve these words here. So first is disease, and the second is rare. So they think, oh, it's a disease and it's rare, so it's probably a recessive trait. And so they typically think, well, in order for someone to have that, they have to have 2 little a's, or whatever the allele is. So that's an easy mistake to make when something is considered rare. But you need to realize that it says here in the question that is autosomal dominant disease. So that means anytime you have the dominant gene, the big A, or in this case we're going to use O's, anytime you have the big O, you have the disease. So just like all the questions that we have regarding genetics, the first thing to answer is what possible gametes could each parent give. So think about the father or the mother, what gametes they could each produce. Pause the video, figure that out, and then come back. So you should have figured out that your mom will give 2 little o alleles, and your dad will have 1 big O and 1 little o. So let's take a moment and talk about how come we know that your dad's big O, little o, and not just 2 big O's. All it says in the question is that he has the disease. So what tells us this is because we know that you have 2 siblings without the disease. So they had to receive a little o from both your mom and from your dad so that they won't have the disease. So the last part of the question, now that you've figured out what the parent's genotype is, figure out the probability that you have the disease. So use these genotypes here, the possible gametes from your parents, do a quick Punnett square, figure out the probability of you having this disease. So after you did a Punnett square or worked it out in your head, you should have figured out that the probability that you have this disease is 1/2. So in a question like this, it may seem pretty simple dealing with autosomal dominant disorders. Where it kind of gets tricky is if you have to work backwards. If you're told maybe what the offspring's genotype is, and you have to figure out the parents. Or oftentimes you'll be given a tree that just has, the unshaded and shaded for those who have the disease, and you have to figure out what kind of inheritance it is. So be careful not to think just because few people have it, it's recessive. Sometimes it could be dominant, there's just a small number in the population who have it. So be careful not to make those mistakes, and you should be good. So let's try to work this out. So let's drag both of your parents down here, and we'll start talking about what their possible genotypes are. So if you have AB blood, we know that we get one allele always from our mom, one from our dad. And so one of the two of them has to have an A and the other has to have a B. So we'll say that dad has an A and mom has a B. So if you switch to the other way around, dad with a B and mom with an A, that's fine. But we know one has to go to each. So that's our first step. So we also know that your sister's blood type is O positive. And so in order for someone to have an O type, they have to have both alleles being an O. So that means she had to get an O from both mom and dad. So that helps us out to figure out what the other allele is. So for both mom and dad, they have to each have one O allele. So now we're going to talk about the Rh factor, the positive or negative. So this is where a lot of students get confused, but really it's not that confusing. Positive is dominant over negative. So anytime that there's a positive, that's what will show up. And so let's talk about the different options, different possibilities that your mom and dad could be. So there's a couple different options for the Rh factors for the mom and dad, the positive and negative. So the easiest and I guess kind of most obvious is that both your mom and your dad could be Rh positive. So that would result in you and your sister, AB positive and an O positive. So that would be an easy way to do it, an easy answer. There's also the option that one parent is positive and the other is negative. So like I mentioned earlier, the positive is dominant, so you wouldn't see the negative in the children. All of the children would be positive. So right here we have it as dad positive, mom negative. You could also have dad being negative and mom positive. So those are the options. So dad negative, mom positive, mom negative, or both dad and mom being positive. So if you came up with those three options, you got it right. Good job. So that almost has the question answered. There's one last little thing that we've got to do. So as you should know, AO positive, BO positive, those aren't blood types. The O allele is recessive. So dad's blood type is just going to be A positive. We know that that O is there. We figured it out because of your sister. And then mom's blood type is going to be B positive. So this is the final answer to the question. It's important that we remember that those O's are there, but that we don't see them expressed as the phenotype. So that should be enough to help you out with questions regarding blood type. Hopefully you're able to figure the ones out in the homework.